When we use the word apocalypse in English, we usually use it to mean the end of the world, or something that is very much like what we expect the end of the world to look like, a scene of utter devastation. When we describe something as being apocalyptic, it's like a cataclysmic event that leaves utter destruction in its wake. Now, the reason why we use the word that way is that the word is actually the Greek word for revelation, and it comes from the book of Revelation in the Bible. When we look at the book of Revelation, the Greek word, the Greek title for the book of Revelation is the Apocalypse. And we usually think of the book of Revelation as describing this series of cataclysmic events that are going to occur before the end of the world. Now, whether or not that's really what's going on in the book of Revelation is kind of a different question, and I'm not going to go there right now. But what we also need to understand is that the term apocalypse and apocalyptic is used in a technical sense to describe a kind of literature, a genre of literature, which frankly we don't really have anymore. And it's important for us to understand this because as we read the book of Revelation, and as we read several books in the Old Testament, Daniel, Zechariah, parts of Ezekiel, maybe even some elements of Isaiah, it's important for us to understand what apocalyptic literature is, because if you don't know what it is, you won't know how to read it. We have today lots of styles of literature that we instinctively know how to read. We know how to read a novel. We know how to read a cookbook. We know how to read a love letter. We read these in different ways because we know the rules of what it is that we're looking at as we read these different types of literature. This is just sort of normal to us. When it comes to apocalyptic literature, though, it's a style of literature we don't have anymore. So we don't really have an instinctive understanding of how to go about reading it. And it's really important for us to know that if we're going to make sense of these books in the Bible. So what is apocalyptic literature? Apocalyptic literature is a kind of, heightened prophecy. It's a form of prophecy, but it's a prophecy kind of on steroids in a lot of ways. The theme of apocalyptic literature is God's sovereignty over history. Apocalypses will frequently have an entire schema, an entire layout of history, frequently using a series of symbolic numbers, 4, 7, 10, 12, that are often repeated or that form a series of eras that sequence one after another through history. So if you think of Daniel, you have a statue made of 4 different kinds of material that represent 4 empires, or you have 4 beasts coming out of the sea that represent 4 different empires, and so on. In Revelation, there's one group of 7 after another, after another, after another. So you'll have these sequences of symbolic numbers, frequently representing different eras of history, though not necessarily. They will use all kinds of strange images, bizarre images. Now, to understand these images, you have to go back into the Old Testament. There will be core images called seed images in the Old Testament that will be developed and elaborated and frankly strained nearly to the breaking point into all kinds of strange and weird pictures. But if you know the Old Testament, you'll recognize where they come from, what the original image was, and that gives you a hint in terms of how to interpret it. The images don't only come from the Old Testament, they also come, in some cases, from pagan mythology. You see this in the book of Revelation with the dragons, for example. So, in order to understand apocalyptic literature, you have to understand the seed images. One analogy that you can use is they're sort of like political cartoons. In order to understand a political cartoon, you have to understand the images that are in them. So in America, if you see a donkey, you know it refers to the Democrats. You see an elephant, you know it refers to the Republicans. Traditionally, if you see an eagle, it represents the United States. A bear represents Russia. A lion represents England. And a dragon represents China. We don't see these as often today, but in older political cartoons, that was the vocabulary, that was the language, and anybody looking at those cartoons would understand them. Revelation works in much the same way. or apocalyptic literature generally works in much the same way. There are these seed images that when people run into them, even in these elaborated, bizarre forms that you get in them, they understand the image, they understand the language, they've got the vocabulary, and they can recognize the roots and see what it is saying. If we don't know that, if we don't know what they did, we're going to be misled in reading this because we're not going to be reading it according to the rules of the genre. So what we see thematically is God's sovereignty in history, frequently done in terms of sequences of symbolic numbers. These can represent eras, not necessarily. We see these seed images developed into these very elaborate pictures, and so on. These are some of the elements of apocalyptic literature, some of the most important ones. And it's important to be aware of these things as you approach the book of Revelation, as you approach Daniel, as you approach Zechariah, a number of these others. Daniel, Zechariah, and some of the Old Testament ones are actually early apocalypses, and they begin providing us with some of the prototypes of what later apocalypses will use. There are a whole series of these things that aren't in Scripture, but the ultimate example is the book of Revelation, again in Greek apocalypse, which then gives us the title of the genre of literature. They're all called apocalypses, or apocalyptic literature generally. And since they point to God's sovereignty in history, and ultimately to God's triumph in the end, in Christian terms, to the return of Christ, they do point to the end of the age. And with that, and with the great judgments on the earth that they portray, this gives us the popular use of apocalypse or apocalyptic as being these great acts of devastation on the earth. But in its technical sense, when we're talking about biblical literature, that's not quite what it's about.